How are we doing, Emilio? Ladies, how are y'all doing? Emilio, how are you doing today, sir? You doing okay?
I'm doing great. I skipped the second part of my class to be here for a while, so yeah.
Well, you are a good soul. I loved our econ conversation dearly. That was so much fun, and I wrote down so many notes. So thank you for that. And Sanduni and Michelle, how are you doing today, ladies? Y'all doing all right?
Very well, thank you.
Very well. Hi. Hello, Emilio.
Emilio is great. Now, Emilio, that's my wife, Michelle, and our dear friend Sanduni, who's visiting at the house. So Sanduni's magnificent. And you ladies may have seen, Emilio is magnificent. We had that wonderful conversation on economics and different things. So Emilio is great. And ladies, y'all recently just did a conversation that was on the OG Rose Anchor that I enjoyed listening to. Would you care to elaborate on that at all?
Sure. Do you want to do it, Michelle?
Jump into being?
Yes, jump into being.
Yeah, we're just sort of getting deeper into the idea of like, what does it mean? What is being? How does one become a human being? Obviously being and becoming are ideas that are tied together very, closely. And but yet it's sort of a very paradoxical thing, because there's sort of the sense in which you already are a human being. And yet we were talking about the idea that consciousness and awareness impacts that being somehow. And, if for good, but also can go for bad too, actually. Awareness can go either way. And even the idea of trying to be balanced in your awareness can make you overthink. And that's then too far in the one direction than the other. So basically just this idea that somehow awareness can make a very big difference in presence, in being present. And then we were kind of inspired by something we had watched together. And so this idea of how do we derive our peace from our being? And so, yeah, the ability to sort of, we've talked about curiosity. We got into a lot of how the childlikeness of that disposition often can afford possibly this idea of being a human being, as a verb in a sense. As adults, do we integrate the curiosity and therefore having a greater and a more open awareness to our phenomenological surroundings?
Yes, I think the conversation was initially inspired, like Michelle said, from this talk that we briefly listened on Instagram. And it was about this particular statement really stood out to me that said, we derive our peace from being. Now, in order to derive peace or have peace, one must really understand one's being. And then came the wordplay while we had a conversation about human being. It's all our human experiences that make our being. Now then, as a human, we're constantly influenced by our social, physical, mental, economical situations, our surroundings. So what factors helps a human determine their being? I mean, we don't really consider everything that happened to us as profound situations or experiences or moments of different realizations. It's certain events or experiences or thoughts or influences that shape our being. And then we moved on to talking about children and how their human experiences allow them to be in a very free sense, because they're limited by their physical condition. They are children. They have the privilege of existing and being themselves, or whatever we think they are at that very time of the day or at that very particular age. But as we grow up to becoming adults, we're deprived of that. We're suppressed because we have to be right and polite and morally grounded and restricted and aware of our surroundings. So my question is, in seeking awareness of one's being, are we neglecting complete awareness of our surroundings? Because unlike children, we can't truly exist in the moment. They do. They say what they please. They do what they please. And obviously there is consequences to their actions. But with humans, we make a conscious effort to be unconscious, because all that we consciously want to be is probably not accepted in society or in the situation that we're in. And those are some thoughts that we had. Yes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that it's weird because normally we go through our everyday lives, but there's some, but when we pay attention to like an event or something, it suddenly like jolts us to like these kinds of things, because like you're like a human, right, or an adult, and you're existing, and you're going to school or to work, whatever, and then you're having like all these things, and you're like fully entrenched in what you're thinking, what your objectives are. But then like you go and visit your cousin, and then you see like his very fact of existing, his way of being is so different from yours. So it just like kind of, well, I don't know how to explain, like kind of those moments that sing the Matrix, that you like kind of like, and they're like really useful in the sense that they allow new ways of thinking. And for me, it's, and I've just recently I've discovered this fascinating idea that it's weird, because I talked about it, like I think in the first net or in the second one, about something that I would name like distributed cognition. That's the sense that our being, our body, like we can define which description fits better, but our being, our body, it's not our skin, right? Because when we think of ourselves, we think of ourselves like within the boundaries of our skin, right? Everything that's like inside our skin, it's us, and then there's the outside world, and of course we relate with the outside, and obviously it influences in some way, but we have this firm notion that we are our body, basically, right? And for me, it's been a complete and profound revelation that this idea is relatively new. Like it's, if okay, if I'm mistaken, like please correct me, but I read it, and basically in the, I think it's Renaissance, in the Renaissance, when we become like, we step out of seeing the world as a theologically, but and more like mechanically, right? So before that point, we lived in a world like full of values, right? And then now we live in a world that's a machine. So that makes and the era of science and logic and all of this. But something weird happens, right? Because we change the way we view the universe, reality, the cosmos. We like so profoundly, it affects us as well. And we start viewing our body differently, because the idea of individualism like comes like from that point onward. We start viewing ourselves like, I am an individual within my family, within my community, but I am like, the human becomes the atomic, it becomes like an atomic thing. You are yourself, you are not the tree, you are yourself, you become atomic, you become this self-contained thing, right? And that for us is like logical, and we do our philosophy within this with this idea in mind, with our psychology. Like I like on Twitter, as I said to Daniel, like Freud describing our psyche is, it takes like, the unconscious assumption is that we are atomic beings, right? If we think ourselves in different ways, like if we, it changes us drastically. And to clarify this point, because maybe it's weird and obtuse, is that I'm like, actually for class, they told us to read this book called The Anthropology of the Body and Modernity. Well, it's in Spanish, so I'm translating the title. Maybe it's different in English. The author is David Le Breton. That I hope it, I think it's French. I hope I pronounce it correctly. And it has the most beautiful example, because there's this tribe in Melanesia, I think, that's like Polynesia, like the islands that are like on the step, like close by Australia, and it's really cool, because they go to this tribe, and he cites another person that went and interview them, and and they don't have a word for skin, the same way they describe the the bark of the tree is the same word they use for their skin. They don't have a word for liver. They have a fruit that kind of looks like a liver, so they use that. So in the sense, in a very real sense, they think of their body as part of the vegetal realm. I don't know if that's the correct term, but like they don't think themselves are like animals or human. They see themselves as a plant, basically, right? Like they see themselves as another tree, like a walking tree, right? And it's really weird and interesting, because you would say like, okay, that's like a neat idea, but it profoundly changes the way they think, because they don't view, how do I explain? They don't view their body as themselves. They are, in a very real and practical sense, their environment. They are not influenced by their environment. They are their environment, like the trees, the nature, their own community, in a very real way. And the psychology changes because, for example, and it's weird, right? Because they still have like skin like us, and they still have eyes. Like, it's not that the physical properties of their body like suddenly change, right? It's not that, but their conceptual self changes completely. And it's so radical, because if you view yourself as the environment, like, a lot of things changes, and practical things, like, for example, our justice system like trials a person, an individual, right? Like, it's like the atomic person body that did the action, right? But you could say the parents are as responsible of the man that grows up to light fires, right? Or the friends, or the how. So it's this atomic individualistic view that the bodies, it's not been around that long, and I think it poses certain pathologies that we experience nowadays, like loneliness and this type of thing. Like, you cannot be lonely if you are the trees, right? Like, you're just part of another thing. To maybe to say another metaphor or analogy is like, imagine that we're like, you're a hand, right? A hand, but you're still part of a body, right? An arm, like a torso, a head. But if the hand believed it was like all there is, and the hand hurts, it may say like, oh, and we are going to see, and you spend time here diagnosing the problem, when maybe the problem is the heart that is not pumping enough blood to the hand, right? So like, so many, like, to go to back to an area of Freud, like, he diagnoses like pathologies just focusing or paying attention to the individual, right? To this little center, when just take step back and say like, the person is not only this but this, right? You have a much more bigger room to play with. It makes more sense, because some things that you cannot explain when you think of the human as this atomic body, when you think about it as like encompassing more than just the physical body, then it becomes a really interesting conversation, right? And well, there are some other examples, but I think it's a hard thing to explain. I hope I did like at least an okay job, but it's just wild. It's just wild, and today we view our body through the lens of medicine and biology. We think our body as veins and cells, and but we don't think of it as the trees, right? We don't think the tree is part of us in the sense, and the way that is the tree, like, okay, yeah, I think it's just like a really interesting concept. And as you said, like, as a beginning, as Michelle and Sanduni were saying, like, it's, yeah, the environment not only influences us, but in a way, at least this book or this idea is that we are our environment in a very real way.
It's interesting because there seems to be a ditch on either side of the road. One of the reasons that Freud will talk about psychoanalysis becoming necessary is, as the world becomes a first world nation, it actually will need psychoanalysis, precisely because your social environment kind of forces you to identify more atomically. Berger, Hunter, all of them will note that beliefs are not merely individual, they're social. If you believe you're part of your environment, but your entire world around you believes that you're not, then it's very hard to believe that. that. So there's a tendency as nations become first world to also become more individual. Now there's some good of this, because as you move to an individual, you can introduce concepts like responsibility, progress, and whatever that makes people very scientifically minded. It seems they seem very good at invention. Dietrich McCloskey will talk about this. But then it seems as if you go too far, and then you end up, say, in the radical atomization of, say, a Japan, or the people defining today in the meaning crisis, where you go too far. So it's very interesting. There seems to be some sweet spot between these two positions that I think you could introduce Hegel, you know, because you have this movement from consciousness to self-consciousness. Self-consciousness requires there to be other self-consciousnesses for you to identify yourself as a self-consciousness. But then the movement into reason is a beginning, to put it generally, of an identification with otherness, not merely a seeing yourself as self-consciousness thanks to others, but then a movement into identifying with others, where you're still in your self-conscious. You don't ever occupy the consciousnesses of other people, but you begin to move into to an identification of becoming other. And that seems to be very tricky, but a lot, and then I'll pass it to Sanduni and Michelle, it would seem a lot of, say, the movement of psychoanalysis that emerges in the 20th century, you know, and then to this day, arguably, is a response to the forcing of people to identify themselves more and more as an individual, of whom is located in relations, though, that then they have to figure out how to deal with, how to balance, and where to go from there. And to this very day, people are still trying to figure out that difficult balance, as I think we see in the, you know, what's generally called the meaning crisis, mental health, and so forth. But ladies, please.
Thank you, Emilio. Thank you, Daniel. And Sandy as well. Hi, Cadell as well. I wanted to say on Hegel, that was good, Daniel. I think that, see, that's what I was saying when I brought up about this balance. You know, it's like you do need awareness, but you can become overly aware. You can become self-conscious when really you kind of just want to be, right? But somehow be aware of that without being overly aware and have that become overthinking. But then also not thinking about it at all suddenly becomes like, how are you even engaging with your reality and yourself, etc. I think Hegel's a great point, because then it's about the dialectic, right? It's almost like you can, if you fall into the one, it's not that you have to be like, oh no, I'm not finding the perfect balance. You just realize that you're going to oscillate back into the other. And that's okay. You know, there's a sort of, I think there's a freedom, like this freedom we're talking about, that's kind of necessary to have this the ability to derive peace from being, where you can, you understand that actually it's going to fall back into one or the other in this dialectic as you kind of progress into a further understanding of yourself and of your reality. And, you know, I thought that was great, Emilio, with this idea of the environment. It's not like you're in your environment, or it's like you are your environment. It's literally this idea of it being so symbiotic and almost like you are part of the ecology, you know. And what I think is interesting about that is, like, as Daniel, as you said, as we've moved toward first world nations and such, there's a way in which, like, even our houses, like, we have structures now phenomenologically that kind of individuate ourselves or separate ourselves. And I'm not, you know, I think everyone can be grateful for like a safe, warm home in the winter or cool home in the summer, etc. But there is this sort of separation, right? There's more and more barriers that are just sort of accepted, utilized, and just made very common. But it does impact our realization of our relation to the environment itself, to nature itself, to the trees. And I think children are very good. That's why children often, like, they just will go out, like, doesn't matter if it's freezing cold, they want to go outside and play with the snow. Like, children have an affinity for just being outside and getting dirty and, you know, like just running around or running to some part of the land that nobody ever walks to, because, and so they have, I feel like their barrier is not as robust, like they have not built up that barrier as much as we do as adults. And for a good reason. I mean, again, there's a place for that barrier, of course, but there's a way in which it perpetually, like, kind of thinking it's just always there and not in a dialect with like the barrier being up and down, is what I think starts to kind of make the self more isolated and self-relating versus in relation, you know. And so, yeah, I think those were some of the thoughts that came to mind. And I do think that's there's something really beautiful about thinking of ourselves so in tune and in touch and as one with nature. You know, it can kind of sound like a, you know, hippie phrase or something like that, but it's really, really important, because then we actually realize that we actually are constantly in relation. That helps with the sense of all of the things that unfortunately modern man can face or deal with in its kind of compartmentalized life, cubicle style life, you know, categorizations that really just sort of end up being these, again, constant barriers on all sides. And then that leads to the isolation, loneliness, you know, like lack of understanding of place and purpose in your own world. And it's like, well, actually, it's just you are part of this broader, it's like this kind of broader self, you know, it's like you in relation really with the earth itself, the land around you, the people around you, the places around you, the structures around you, the architectural structures around you. So anyways, those are a couple of thoughts that came to mind. Sandy?
I think that was all very good from Daniel, Emilio, and Michelle. And this sort of almost brings me to another point. We clearly philosophized the notion of being in our discussion, and that's what we're doing right now through the net. And it's almost like, with all the analogies and the examples and the metaphors used in explaining what being is between us, we distract ourselves from the common interpretations of what life and existence is. And this whole idea of virtual versus real, and virtual not in the digital sense, but virtual in the sense that the perceptions, the ideologies, the illusions that we have in our mind, and the actual physical reality, our environment, our social surroundings, the people that we physically exist or coexist with. And there is a fine correlation between the two in terms of defining being, and especially through this discussion, because there is a new and acquired physiognomy in the way we interpret being. Because the analogy that Emilio used about skin and just the agriculture in general. Now, when we discuss skin, there is the outer physical layer, the appearance, the very tangible sort of existence of skin and in terms of flesh. And then there is the substance underneath it, the intricate cells and the science and the anatomy behind it, but also the way there is fluidity in our body and in our minds. And that comes through this large sense of philosophizing our existence. And I feel like this statement comes with my discussion earlier with Daniel, whereas Daniel presented this question about, is philosophy storytelling? And I'm trying to sort of bridge the connection between the two. It really is storytelling, but also we could identify, or rather question, is it trying to understand the art of one's being in their telling or in their narrative? And to what extent do we understand the reality? Sorry about that. That was a dramatic.
No, that's our special effects department. Man, our special effects department is great. Wow, that was great. I'm
just very excited to be right now that everything is falling apart. Almost, so I would like to sort of wrap up this particular idea,
please,
or what I express with this question. Now, can we really have certitude in our being and in our comprehension of being? Because like we discussed, there is a virtual reality, and then there is the actual reality. And in the end of the day, our comprehension of our being, or just beings around us, solely depends on our ability to differentiate between virtual and reality, or rather to some extent philosophize our being and ask the right questions. Now, what are the right questions is a whole different topic, but it's almost like, what is good? What is the truth? Is real an illusion? Because yet again, what is real to me is different than what is real to Michelle or to Daniel or to Emilio. And with that, it's almost like it creates room for speculation. And yeah, that's all. That's all for now.
I would just say to that, to what Emilio is saying. So a few things. One, the points that Michelle was getting at, the architecture saying to us that we're individuated. Sam Willman, we've talked, still talk a lot about architecture and how there is a message in that. Michelle has done work on the sociology of space, kind of how when you live on a farm, it says to you that life operates without human control, that there is something alive, even if it's not being engineered. Whereas, say, if you live in a city, the majority of what you experience is a product of human ingenuity. So there's more of a sense that your environment tells to you, that humans can solve any problems they put their mind to it. Whereas on a farm, you can do everything you're supposed to do and you just don't get rain, so everything dies. So there's always an element outside of your control that is spoken to you by your very environment. So your environment says a lot. And if everyone is, say, living in the first world nations, or living in a certain suburban sort of manner that is more of a nuclear family versus a traditional family, because those are now put together, but they're actually, historically, there's a difference, where the traditional family involves having your parents around or your aunts and uncles, where the nuclear is very, very different. Well, if everyone is living that way, then there's a sort of ethic that creates, because that's, that's the thing. Like whatever your environment tells you what's right, whether you want it to or not, like it speaks to you indirectly on what is right and what is not right. And so likewise, too, if you have a certain conception of the human being as not being separated from their environment, then that very phenomenological experience says to you that it's right for human beings not to be separated by their environment, to not think of themselves as such. But if you live in a first world nation where you think of yourself as separate from your environment, and maybe emphasize the capacities of human beings to change their environment, that it's right for humans to have complete control over their environment. So we always, the phrase at the beginning of the conflict of mind is that truth organizes values, which is to say whatever we think is true determines what we think is good, false, lying, justice, all of that. It's like Emilio was saying with the courtroom. If you believe that, like, if you have a conception of the human being as very much embedded in their environment, then that would transform the nature that laws and justice are written. So you can never escape. In a sense, what this all means is that your structure of rights, values, and philosophy in general is inseparable from the story that you tell yourself about the human being and the story about the right environment. This is what's very interesting, because in the last net session, Mr. Andrew Luber, we were talking about, and Alex, even all of us and different people, we were talking about the relation between story and philosophy. And the sort of question is all philosophy storytelling? Or not? Why not? Mr. Jockin made the point that, in philosophy, it's more of systems building often than it is story building. But then there is something about where in the creation of a story, you're making a kind of system. All the characters have to interact together. It all has to be internally consistent, but it's not just a system. And so it's very interesting. Mr. Luber and I were emailing, and it's almost like the structure of life is a story, whereas the theme of life is philosophy. And I'm using that distinction between story and theme because that's from Mr. Luber's language. So everything we do has a certain kind of philosophical orientation, with philosophy meaning our metaphysical beliefs, like what we think is meaningful, what we think is valuable, what we think we ought to do. All of those are kind of philosophical, ergo thematic. Like what's the theme of your day right now? I'm eating food. I'm writing. There's a theme to your day. And then when you ask what is the structure of your day, it's kind of like a story. Daniel is standing in front of the Zoom camera. He's in X setting. There's a kind of story going on. And I think also it becomes very clear that operating according to value, ergo theme, ergo philosophy is inseparable when we take seriously Mr. Samuel Barnes' Missing Axioms, where he makes the point that it's completely impossible to be a nihilist because you're always operating by what you think you should and should not do. If you're lying on a couch, you think it's good to lie on a couch, even if you don't think life has meaning. So you're always operating to meaning. And as we mentioned, Mr. Barnes has put out a new book called The Iconoclast. Buy now on Amazon for a very good price. It's really freaking elegant. Mr. Barnes is elegant. And this is actually very relevant. So everyone go buy this book. I'm also reading Raymond K. Hessel's new book on the Notes from a Pod. That's really outstanding. And I was going to bring that back where he talks about Plato's cave is now mobile. It's not merely like static. We carry the cave around with us. His writing is really good. I really like Raymond because he reads a lot of books that people don't write and he explores a lot of topics that people don't explore. But anyway, Samuel Barnes wrote a book called Missing Axioms, and this is the follow through on it, The Iconoclast. And in that he kind of basically says you always have to act according to values. Well, that would mean you're always acting according to philosophy, and the philosophy that you're acting according to is manifest in your life as a story. And so there seems to be some sort of profound, I want to say, dialectical relationship between story and philosophy. And Emilio is getting at this, and where everyone's getting at this, because kids tell a story of themselves where they are not totally individuated from their environment or even their imagination, where they just are what they want to be. They're like this kind of ability to be very fluid. Well, therefore, the themes of their day reflect that fluidity. what they think they ought to do, what they can do, what they cannot do, that is reflected in how they see themselves. And the story of their day reflects that idea as well. Well, likewise, if you view yourself as a totally individuated person in suburbia America, well, then that is reflected in the story of how you live your day and how you think constitutes a valuable use of time. And why? So, and then I'll pass it on to whoever wants to speak. We've discussed at the net how it seems to be this question of the relation of story and philosophy has something to do with escaping Deleuzian capture, the Kafka stories of the castle, the Black Mirror episode, how we kind of the revolution is subsumed into the system. And this question of how does one escape the quote unquote system? How does one escape capture? And we've kind of gradually come to a place where it seems to have something to do with figuring out the relation between story and philosophy. And they seem irreducible. And one of the reasons they seem special, and then I'll pass it on, is because it seems like you can have a philosophy of anything, philosophy of coffee, philosophy of your day, philosophy of philosophy, and so on. And it seems like you can have a story of anything, story of history, story of people, story of so on and so forth. And so these two things seem to be very uniquely meta, almost omni-meta, in their ability to be about anything at any single time. And yet, here's where it changes. If I start talking about the philosophy of story, well, that's not the same as the story of story. And if I talk about the story of philosophy, that's not the same as the philosophy of philosophy. So there's this inability to consume one another into themselves in a manner that maintains the whole, but then they maintain their omni-meta dimension of being about everything. So there's something there that seems very important. And dare I say, it would seem, and then I'll pass it on, that if we can come to own or come to be intentional, those are all fuzzy words, but give them to me at this moment, I beg. It would seem that if we become more aware in a good way of our story and our philosophy, ergo theme, and how they relate to one another, that seems to go a long way to escaping quote unquote capture. And with that, I'll pass it to whoever would like to speak.
Just the last thing you said, for me, it's really interesting. For me, recursive things are really fascinating. Like auto-referential things are really, really weird because that they kind of break the system, right? For example, if you go to like a mathematician, you'll see that if you like poke enough, well, he will become terrified because like we have mathematics and like a mathematic works if we take like certain axioms, certain suppositions, but if you poke those suppositions, like where they come from? Just cause, right? Like we need them to exist for them to do, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to explain this properly, but there's like this like popular YouTube channel called Veritasium, I think it's pronounced, and they have like a really nice breakdown of this, that there was like this weird math thing, like if there's this number that references this, and like if you map all those numbers to like a letter, right, you see that the whole system breaks, like the whole fundamental logic of mathematics breaks, because you need to, for it to be true, one of the cards has to be true, like a priori, like before everything else, right? You cannot construct it without this, right? So when you like when you go into like something that's recursive, right, like philosophy about philosophy or stories about stories, then it becomes fuzzy, because some things like cannot, like it doesn't compute, right? It's an error. It's like it doesn't work. So like you run something so really interesting there. So I agree. And so yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting concept. And for me, like something that's recursive, it's also kind of meta, because if you think about thinking, that feels like a little bit recursive, like taking that step back and saying something meta. And this and when Sanduni was talking, like for me it clicked, because she was like saying like philosophy, what's real, what's not, like how can we like know, right, like this way of being. And for me it's beautiful when you're like, I don't know, you're describing what being is, right, and you take into account like the accounts of Hegel and other philosophers, right, and the contextual thing, and you're like you're forming your definition of what's being, what's becoming, all these words, like all these concepts, and you're like defining them and like giving them meaning, and these words in relation to these other concepts, these other ideas, environments. And then like something like like what I described, like Stockholm, and they say like, oh, your idea of being human is so completely radically different than mine that everything your theories like wouldn't apply to me at all, right? Like again with psychoanalysis, but right, psychoanalysis doesn't even make sense in that tribe that I described. Like it doesn't, it's not even that it doesn't work, it doesn't even make sense, right? Because the contextual thing of it, it's so different. So for me, and I don't think, I don't know if Sanduni phrased the question specifically, but for me it's like if we ask the question, what is being, right? What does it mean to being? We will, I think, or we can arrive to the conclusion that it depends which type of being you're thinking about, right? Because you, as Daniel said, if you're like in an atomic individual in the US, in your family, with your atomic family, etc., you will have a different, radically different being that maybe will benefit from psychoanalysis, but maybe if you go into the tribe and you're part of the trees, then that doesn't work, right? So there cannot be like a being, there can be like multiple ways of being, types of being, right? Because you can, yeah, so when because I don't know, it's like saying, what type of story do we tell about ourselves, right? And we'll say like, oh no, we tell multiple like if you are like in nowadays, like in this year, you will tell like a specific type of story that will make sense to you. But if you're like 100 years past, like it won't, like, you know. So it's not the story we tell ourselves as humans. Like it's like, if we take this type of human, this atomic human, this is their way of being, or this mode of being. If we take this type of human, that the right, or this type of being or environment, etc. So I think that that's useful, because if you're developing this notion of, okay, being means this relation to Hegel and this idea, like there's still some invisible things that we take for granted, right? Like in this case, the atomic individual, right? If tomorrow we suddenly realize that we are not atomic individuals and we start thinking ourselves as trees, then suddenly that theory doesn't change anymore, right? So we have to change it, and we think like, oh, we just didn't nail what being was, but it's not, like, oh, it's different ones. And if we, and I think it's useful because like you can categorize like, oh, okay, this type of philosophy, psychology thing, it's useful for this, like this atomic individual, but like this, or like for this one, and then it becomes like something actually manageable, or you can not complete, but you can more or less clearly define what being is if you set the parameters of for this type of individual, let's say, right? So for me, that was a really nice like unlock or thought that I really liked. And yeah, that's it. Really cool.
I think both of you made this point, Emilio and Daniel, that our physical experiences, or rather where we live, whether it's the suburbs or the city, influence our idea of being. Now, it's interesting that you both said this, because John Locke says that no man's experience, no man's knowledge goes beyond his human experience. Because when you talk about knowledge and your comprehension of being, it's profound how the accumulation of knowledge almost does not actually influence your being if you talk about it, because there are a lot of knowledgeable people that don't really acknowledge or identify their being as a certain way, or think that they are capable of understanding other beings. And this is where there is philosophical speculation versus modern education, or just being smart in the literal conventional sense, and the whole idea between being wise and being knowledgeable. Now, coming back to the point of being, I think it's really important for one to understand not just one's physical environment, because that is important. It does influence how we come to certain conclusions. But what if we try and question the very literal existence of our being, like our surroundings? Yes, if it's hot, you'd like to live in a cool house. And yes, if it's cold, you'd like to live in a warm house. Having said that, how are you sort of understanding the the dimension, the physical dimension versus the spiritual or mental dimension of being. Can you differentiate between the two? I think this is a constant question that I even ask myself. And does the definition of being keep changing as you evolve? That's also another thing that I would like for us to discuss about, or rather have some comments made on, because there is a physical sense of being, there's a mental sense of being, and there is a spiritual sense of being, or at least that's how I perceive it. What do you think, Michelle?
Yeah, well, I think that that's interesting. I mean, I think that in a way, you know, our being is going to be informed by these different like aspects or elements, right? And I think it makes me think a little bit about Nietzsche's emphasis on the body, actually, and the environment, the earth, and sort of this idea of being able to like actually consult your body as almost being like a spiritual thing, even though it's the body itself. And so I think that they're actually working so reciprocally with one another that it's really only when we start to think about it that we kind of separate, you know, the body and the spirit and the environment itself that we're in, you know. But that kind of goes back to sort of the, you know, what do we mean by awareness, right? I think that it's certainly fine to sort of pick apart. That's what in some ways we are doing as in philosophizing, but to sort of pick apart how do these different things kind of Venn diagram or like overlap or whatever. But I think the state of awareness seems to be when all of those things are happening in a harmony, right? Like in this kind of beautiful harmony where they inform one another and don't take away from one another. They inform one another. So that's what comes to mind, like just off the top of my head, Sanduni.
And I also think, I mean, with the whole notion of philosophizing being, it is not just the perennial search for truth, rather trying to identify different perceptions or the interpretation of the truth of being. And when you try and do that, I saw a comment that was made that said being can change, being changes. But then why is it always like the ultimatum? Why is being supposed to be a sort of definite answer? Like, you know, you finally concluded your existence, or, you know, you've identified your purpose of your being, but why can't it sort of be an evolving process? Or at least this is just me trying to identify ways in which people interpret being. It's almost like in competition with to be, and when you consider wordplay, it's just a continuous sense of just being is to be. It's like BE-ing. So you're just trying to be and yet evolve in that being.
Well, I'll comment on that. And Titan, always good to see you, my good man. It's a delight, and thank you very much, ladies. You know, there's a few things, and there's this kind of idea that I think what you're getting at, Sanduni, because, you know, famously, you know, Hegel at the beginning of the Science of Logic is basically like, hey, pure being is nothingness, because if it literally was a pure being, there would be no differentiation and it would be nothing to you, right? And yet there's this weird way that we can linguistically use the term being and kind of know what we're getting at, right? Like we're like, oh, being, like the state of things. And yet none of us live in a state of thing. It's always at the very least, even if you're like in this room, let's say theoretically I could be in this office and literally nothing changed. Like it was literally practically causally identical between now and like an hour from now. What would be changing is what I was looking at, how I was interpreting the bookcase, how I was thinking about the bookcase. There would still be a kind of becoming, a sort of movement that would be occurring in myself as a subject. So you never have like a solid state. Like if you had a solid state, you'd be dead, right? And then, you know, Cadell and I, we've been kind of discussing, and then Mr. Ebert has done such good work on this as well, on this notion that anytime when we talk about nothing being or becoming autonomously as an independent concept that doesn't relate to the others, it becomes an effacement. It becomes very problematic and causes certain pathologies. And yet at the same time, what's very interesting is Philippe was mentioning this with Emilio, is the notion that why is it that we come to believe we're separate from our environment, right? Like there's this real sense in which we are not, and yet we also come to think that we are. Well, that's interesting. Why? Why does that thought arise in consciousness, right? Well, one of the reasons would seem to be is precisely because I seem capable of directing cause and effect. Whether or not I do or not, it seems like I'm able to pick up this pen quite easily and move it, right? Whereas the environment doesn't, the bookcase doesn't tend to take the pictures off the wall. It doesn't tend to pick up pictures. So there seem to be different streams of cause and effect that I would define between causality and creation or direction. The human seems able to direct the environment in ways that is unique to the environment, not because the environment does not change, but because almost the readiness, the quickness by which the environment can change or respond to stimuli is very different. So for example, if a fire was coming toward me, I'd get out of the way, but the bookcase would not, right? There's a difference in how there's a response of the environment. And so gradually you come to conclude that, okay, I as a human being am some sort of node, if you will, that responds to stimuli different than other things in the environment. Now, what seems to be dangerous, though, is to take it too far to the point of a radical autonomy, atomization that has nothing to do with the environment. But it seems to be the reason we do it is because there's some sort of sense between the different way that we respond to stimuli or direct the environments than from what other things do. The other thing, so that seems to be what kind of facilitates it. And what's interesting, Cadell brought up the part of Nietzsche's child. And there seems to be a big difference between childish, which is kind of impulsive, and childlike, which is this creative ability that Nietzsche wants to emphasize. And then the question becomes, how do we move out of childish to adult to childlike? And then, of course, everyone knows that in Nietzsche, there's the camel, the lion, and the child are these stages. So how does one move from those things? It would seem as if most of us, especially in the Western world, maybe go out of being childish to an adult, and that's it. We never move back to a kind of childlike. We kind of grow up and we think that kids are silly and childish as opposed to have some sort of revelation to teach us. And that would be an example where we don't identify with the other, because as an adult, the other is a child, actually. When you're an adult, it's almost like the child is a revelation of a different kind of being, like a radical different kind of being. Other adults just have other occupations generally, or maybe other life choices, but real radicalness of carrying oneself in the world is shown in children. I'm not just saying just children, but they tend to be a powerful revelation. So for the adult to identify with the child seems really important for the movement into this childlikeness. And then another thing I'll say before passing it on, what's interesting also about philosophy as seeming to have some sort of necessary role in how we relate to life, there's nothing in reality that tells you that you need to become a camel. And then when you're a camel, there's nothing in reality that says you need to become a lion. And then there's nothing in reality that says you need to become a child. Like, you just have to basically know that you should. If you do, you can always create a rationalization that you should stay a camel, to use Nietzsche's language. You can always use a rationalization that the lion is the high peak. And you can always use a rationalization that childlikeness is childish. How do you decide that that's not the case? There's really nothing in reality, like in the given environment, in phenomenology, that says you should do it, and yet you can choose to do it and thus direct your life in a manner that is different. Well, those values, which would be the theme of your story, is something that you seem to choose unto you. And I call this the absolute choice. You choose it. It's a thing that you choose to become the theme of your life that then changes the structuring of your story and how you go. But there's nothing in the world that gives that to you. You have to choose to see it. Now, you, of course, when I say nothing, I'm not saying that there are literally no stimuli or no experience that can fit into a movement from, say, camel to lion and lion to child. But you ultimately have to choose to see the parts together, or the different experiences that you have leading you that way. So why do you make that choice? Why do you not make that choice? And what kind of choice did you make? And all of this seems to suggest another reason why we as humans can conclude that we are, say, not part of our environment totally, precisely because we have to make that choice, say, of metaphysical structuring according to theme, while trees do not, as far as we know at least. But unfortunately, we tend to take that differentiation simply to define our difference from the environment, but never to make an absolute choice into becoming a child. We just define ourselves apart and then never take it to the stage of the sort of the challenge that Nietzsche presents us to actually take us where we need to go. So we end up in different forms of effacement. But with that, I'll pass it to whoever would like to speak.
Just risking sounding a little bit insane, like in the example you said, like if a fire comes, like a human would run, right? But what if the bookcase also ran, this may we can see in the sense, this reminds me that, like, of course, like the physical like the bookshelves didn't physically move, right? But we're so anchored in our way of perceiving and existing that we view the environment within our own lens and within our like physical space, right? Like maybe some other stuff like are so have a like an ontology so different than us that like that they run and I think this gets exemplified like in a short story. I don't remember where I read it, but it was like a human is like going on the sidewalk and they see like this little green patch of grass with like tiny people, and suddenly he steps like on a thing and he gets like shrunken down. He can see like all the people and stuff, and they're like, and in time on that little thing was like way quicker, like 100 times quicker, right? So like they can see like they're more evolved, like their way of relating to the world is very different, and because the scale and the physical interactions, like the way they beyond understand and the things they can do is really different, right? But and they have a dog that we need, actually they need his help for something, etc. There's another part, like there's like in that like really like house, like miniature house thing, like you can also like step onto something and go like even like a smaller, right? So it becomes like an atom thing, and like he and they are like presumably in the story they are like conscious being and stuff, but they're like so far removed from anything that we can like experience like from ourselves, that like even the small people, like the regular small people are like, oh, we don't understand them, they just pop like from time to time and they do stuff, but we don't really understand them, right? Then at the end of the story he goes back to being like a fully sized human and stuff, and then he goes on with his day. But like for me it's even, yeah, just like a thought that occurred to me, that just like the bookcase didn't run, like it didn't run from our perspective. And of course, if we believe there's like an objective reality sort of thing, like the physical atoms didn't move, that's completely true. But like maybe from the perspective of the bookcase, we also didn't move, if that makes sense, right? So yeah.
No, and not to interrupt, I want to add to that. What you're getting at is, so for example, there's good reason to believe that the bookcase is ultimately made of quantums, and the properties of the quantums are different from, say, large objects. And we have this giant debate between general relativity and quantum mechanics, and I will not claim to be any sort of expert on it, but there's notions of super transposition where, you know, things are going through time in different ways. I don't know. It really does. But the point is that it is very possible that objects that we experience in the world are not like we think they are. And yet we necessarily experience the bookcase as if it is a certain 3/4 dimensional entity, and then correspondingly necessarily structure our story and theme accordingly. And this is where we're always already in this dialectic of story and theme, or story and philosophy, because I'm using story and theme from Mr. Luber's, like it's already there. And it's interesting because like we don't like when we're born, like we don't like when we're born, you know, you were making the point very well on mathematics where there has to be one card that's assumed, right, for the whole thing to be processed, right? Like when we're thrown into the world, it's not like, you know, God comes up to us and is like, hey, you know, when you're born, would you like to choose to perceive quantums, or would you like to choose to perceive larger objects? How would you like to perceive reality? Because your entire philosophy and story will be constructed accordingly. No one comes up with that. You know, you're just thrown into it, and then you structure your story and theme. And what's interesting, and this, so you are also, it would seem as if story and theme, or I'm going to say story and philosophy because that's what I mean by theme. I'm just using that for Mr. Lewis. I think it's good language because your theme is your kind of values and meanings and your metaphysical principles that you operate for. So story and philosophy seem to emerge independent of one another, dialectically relating from action, from like motivation. Like you're born into the world and you're acting in the world. And the moment you are acting, you are structuring what you are doing according to a story in concordance with what you think you ought to do. So there's this sort of movement, and then your acting in the world, your action in the world is creating that as you go. But your action in the world is necessarily part of the world, of which is one where you do not experience quantums, where you experience 3 to 4 dimension objects. So then all of philosophy and story of you are all set in that setting, if you will, and reflects that setting. And there is nothing in your life that will ever say to you from that setting that it ought not to be that way. If you decide that actually, no, that bookcase is made of quantums, and actually my understanding of how the world is structured is different from that, there's a choice there. There's an interpretational choice there that if I choose to see this bookcase as, say, made of quantums, it's not like the bookcase turns into quantums. It's still there as quantums in my phenomenological experience, and yet I choose to see it differently. And in so choosing to seeing differently, I can change how I respond to the world. And likewise, if I choose to see people as part of my identity and relationships, then it's not like the person like blends with me in some sort of spooky blob thing. Phenomenologically, they're the same, and yet I've changed my setting, if you will, thus changed how I may act in the world, and thus changed the dialectic of story and philosophy that emerges from out of that action. But all of this comes from an interesting sort of choice. And then before I pass it on, it makes me think, Trey Tellosbaum was just having a conversation, well, not just having, I just listened to it, but recently had a conversation with Todd McGowan. And Dr. McGowan was making the point that although Hegel seems to suggest that philosophy cannot change the future, actually, for Hegel, if philosophy changes the meaning of the past, that changes what we do going into the future. So like, it's not that, so it's kind of funny because philosophy is like, when philosophy tries to directly change the future, like plan what ought to occur, that creates a lot of pathologies and problems. But if philosophy instead says, well, actually, let's look back and understand what the past was and what it meant, that changes the future you go into. Right? So primarily philosophy changes the future by changing our interpretation of the past. That's what he was saying. So philosophy is primarily in a certain sort of the activism of philosophy, which is a dangerous phrase, but if you grant it to me for a minute, the activism of philosophy seems to be in the realm of interpretation and hermeneutics. That seems to be going on because how you interpret the world changes how you carry yourself in the world. Interpretation is action. We tend to think that interpretation is opinion, but what Hegel is showing that is interpretation is action. And basically what you're getting at, Emilio, before I pass it on, is how I interpret this bookcase and how I interpret my relation to it and other people changes my action in the world, which then changes the dialectic of story and theme and philosophy that I operate to. Therefore, it would seem that escaping Deleuzian capture, escaping Black Mirror, escaping Kafka and all the things has something to do with interpretation, because that which is based on choice, which then changes how we act, and that changes where we can go, versus say end up eaten by a cat at the end of a hallway in a Kafka story.
So what do you think is the nature of choice here? Is it simply a choice between, I want black coffee or or coffee with cream or coffee without cream or something of that nature? What do you think is the nature of choice here? What is and I think that has some bearing upon what is the nature of interpretation over here also. Because is it simply a conscious interpretation? I think that this is made of quantums and does that really change things, or is that interpretation something which is linked to our unconscious in some senses, and how do we think through that kind of interpretation? So a kind of interpretation that emerges in, say, free association in Freud, and what is the nature of choice that comes out in free association from a subject? It's not, and how do you think through that?
No, this is extremely excellent because there is now the question of what is the nature of this choice. It does not seem to be merely a choice between objects in the world, but it seems to be a choice of how to see the world. It's a choice of eyes, but then the question becomes, why do you choose to see the world X way and not Y way? Isn't that because someone taught you about quantum mechanics? Isn't that because you received certain stimuli in the world? And this is where the line, it would seem as if we follow this distinction between creation and causation, it would seem as if you can't separate those entirely, because you're always saying, like if you're painting something, you're doing it with paints and a canvas, of which are found in cause and effect. And the reason you're doing it is because someone drove you to the paint store. So there's this link. And yet then with these things given to you in causation, you are bringing them together in a manner that causation would not arise to on its own. Like no matter how long one left a canvas and paints on the table alongside one another, it is very unlikely a tornado will come along and give one Mona Lisa. And even if it was theoretically possible, that would just suggest that the tornado did a creative act, perhaps, right? And it would probably be very, very rare. Raza's paper coming in the anthology speaks about the notion between latent potential, how, sharpening a rock, since rocks have sharpness, is not creative and it's not an abstraction, but say taking a rock and making a fire is an abstract act, because there's nowhere in the rock in its latent potential that would suggest to make a fire, right? And yet humans have this ability of abstraction to see that a rock can be used to make fire. That seems to be the nature of this choice. Something about latent potential, something about where you're seeing the world in terms that is not given by the world, and yet you can see the world in those terms and have it be creative. Now, what is extremely interesting that I think you're getting at, Chitan, before I pass it on, what unlocks in a person, per se, the ability to operate according to this kind of level of abstraction, as opposed to the latent potential of the rock? Where does it come from? Does it come from practicing free association? Does it come from certain environmental stimuli, certain sort of art forms, certain sort of practices? I find that like that to me, actually, ultimately, because basically very often it always gets to this for me, it comes to that question of where in the world does intrinsic motivation come from? How does somebody get it? When I'm not just talking about the impulsive, because we talked about going through the process. Where does that come from? What is that process? What develops that? This seems to be such a massive question, because it does seem to be tied to this escaping of capture question, or this ability to not just be living according to latent potentials, but to actually exercise abstraction in the way Raza is talking about, which for me, I would call creation, of which then has a hermeneutical effect on how you see the world, which thus changes your action, your story and theme, story and philosophy in the world. So I think that's a magnificent question, Titan.
Yeah, just for example, something that, yeah, it always boils down to intrinsic motivation, right? Yeah, it always comes back. And I think I actually have not progressed in the book, but for me, like of course we've talked about a lot of things, like if you the stories we tell ourselves change the way we act, right? The lenses through which we see the world change the way we act. The phrase I said the other day is like, for example, the person that doesn't know how to swim, when they see the ocean, they see a wall, right? That's they see the wall. So that's the most like pointed way of saying it. So the more words escape, like I usually use concepts or meta concepts. The more concepts, the more lenses we have to view the world in different ways, the more it changes. And I think one particularly useful lens or concept that maybe aid you, Daniel, in describing intrinsic motivation is in this book, Incomplete Nature. They say that if you like, for me I love those types of ideas that the moment you hear them, they're like, obviously, it's so simple, but the second before you heard them, you would never have thought of them. And for me, it was one of those, because they said that, okay, so the difference between everything is just configuration. And what does he mean by it? It's like, the atoms in a star are the same atoms in a wall, in a human. Of course, they're like different like atoms that don't exist in one another, but like the fundamental blocks are the same, let's say, right? The fundamental blocks are the same. So why does a human like think and act and ask about philosophy and stories, right? And why does like a rock like do not, allegedly, right? Does not. So the author says that it's just a matter of it's basically a matter of configuration. That if you think about it, how do you get a human brain? You arrange atoms in a specific order that they form neurons, and the neurons are placed in a specific way, and that they process this brain, etc. So in a way, this ability of the human condition to think and reflect and stuff, it's explained or viewed in this lens, right? This is not the only way of viewing it, but viewed in this lens is that the configuration of, in this case, atoms, the configuration provokes certain things, right? So if you have a specific configuration, that's a chair or a brick. If you have a specific configuration, that's a brain. So I think that in a way it's really interesting, because if that's like a new lens in the arsenal, and if you view things that way, you can say like, okay, what is the specific configuration that rises like consciousness, right? And it kind of solves the, like, why is a brick hard, right? Like, wait, when you hit your, like, it's here, you can say, oh, because of the way the atoms are arranged, right? And you can say, like, why does, or where, or why does consciousness come from? And you could, like, it's a kind of a way of describing is like, oh, it's just like arrangement of the specific atoms in a different, if you arrange these atoms this specific way, you get awareness, right? If you arrange them in this specific way, you get a brick. So that's like the base idea. Of course, if like the implication as you go through, like, exponential, like, more like interesting, but as a base idea, I think that's at least an interesting way to look at as ourself and intrinsic motivation. Because when I close my eyes and I think of it as images, I just think of, like, I don't know, like little points, like arranged in different ways, and those points like become the different things we see in the world. And I think yeah, that's for me, it's an interesting and useful way to view about things. And like, if you think of intrinsic, like, where does it come from or where does it arise, you could say, like, in very crude terms, that is an arrangement of a configuration of specific atoms, particles in this way, right? How do we get them to that specific arrangement? Okay, that then we go a step back, right? But I think it's at least an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
What's very interesting about this relation between, I like what you're saying about configuration. If we take the language of the kind of causation and creation, there's a sense in which causation occurs in a given configuration, where creation is changing the configuration so that there's new causation that's now possible. So there's a self-reference that sort of occurs in the creative act. And then what's funny is, once you realize a rock can be made used to fire, to use Raza's example, it's as if the rock was always able to be used for fire, that it always had that potential. And thus it is very difficult to remember that potential was added, in a sense. It was created, and because it then kind of presents itself. Now, the rock had to be configured in a certain way via causation to be capable of creating fire. You can't just create anything in a vacuum. It's bound to the configuration. But then it seems as if humans have an ability to not be totally bound by configuration, where they can make the rock reference itself as, oh, you're hard and you're a stone, and therefore if I do you on another object, another stone, it creates a spark. The configuration opens up a creative possibility, but one that is not given by the object of rock, in the same way that the potential of making it sharper is given by the rock. There seems to be a difference between the idea of making the rock sharper and the idea of using a rock to create fire, if we keep using Raz's example. So taking that further, so for example, like, I have this cup, and the cup would give to you in its causation that I can fill it with liquid. Why? Well, guess what I can also do? I can turn it over and make it a cup stand for my carrot juice, right? So now, like, that was not given to me by the object of cup, but that's now something you think you can do, and there's water all over my table, right? So there's something that is, it could be a Lego holder as well, right? So this is the question, and then I'll pass it to Chitan. What is it that makes a human being one day say, wait a minute, I can see things differently? Wait a minute, I have the ability to see things differently. Because what makes people realize they can do that and then think it's not stupid? Like, to actually say, yeah, I can see things differently. Yes, I am capable of that. Because that ability to make someone do that, what is the art form? What are the practices? What are the therapy, et cetera, so forth, that make somebody say, wait, I can see things differently, and then act on that difference that is not given by the world. That seems to have something to do with Nietzsche's child. That seems to have something to do with the absolute choice. That seems to have something to do with not ending up in a Kafka story trying to get to a castle you can never end up on. But with that, I'll give it to Mr. Chitan.
I'm reading a very, I just finished a book actually by this philosopher called Bernard Stiegler. The book's name is For a New Critique of Political Economy. And he's a very interesting thinker on the questions I think we are discussing here. Essentially, I think one of the questions that we need to start this kind of problem is, and which is why I brought up Freud actually. First is a problem of calculation in some senses. That when you are discussing something, say, new emerging, a person being able to use a rock to create fire, the question that you're trying to raise over there is that there is no way to calculate in advance that rock can be used for fire. Isn't it? That is how we know that potential actually exists over there. If we can simply calculate it, that's not really a creative act. if you can put it in a machine and that calculation can bring us out, or this can be done by like this, it's not genuinely creative. And there is a problem of this sort of binary or couple of calculation versus creation, which we need to untangle here in some sense. I'm not saying I can do it in that sense. I'm just saying this is the contour of that discussion we need to start thinking. The other is, at least to my mind, when Freud thinks that a subject can interpret itself, when he's actually free from his own judgment upon himself, in some senses, there is a form of choice that emerges, not in the sense that the subject says, I choose this over that. And again, not in the sense that when he's calculating what is more beneficial for him. Which is why the first rule of Freud is that you have to, in a therapy session, you have to say whatever comes to your mind. And what is the form of choice that emerges from that free association? And what is the kind of interpretation that emerges from that? That is not an interpretation that you can simply get up and say, I choose to interpret it like this. If you can make a choice like that, it's not really a choice. The choice is much more radical than that. As I think Zizek, I think says somewhere that it's a choice that is already made for you, only discover it later that you made the choice. In some senses, and that is how you discover your authentic self in some regard. That is why it's much more radical in nature, and that is why Freud actually did not go the hypnosis route. He actually had to go the free association route in some sense, because in hypnosis that choice is completely cut down. You don't need to make it. You can completely become a subject which is not interpreting himself. He's simply made to remind that memory, and when he remembers, that happens or not, works or not, and that kind of a problem emerges. You can do that with alcohol and other drugs also. But in free association, a subject has to make that choice through his own free association, and what happens and what emerges there. And again, as I said, the problem will come back to of calculation, because when he's making that choice, he can't calculate. That is the essential condition. And for some interesting reason, this question of motivation, which even Stigler picks up, and which sort of goes back to again question of drive and desire, and there is a deferral of drive leading to new desire in that sense. And sustenance of desire actually demands you to be making the radical choice every time, making that choice without those calculations. Because when you start calculating, your desire gets reduced to partial drives. That is what marketing consumerism does in many ways. If you look at your advertisements and stuff, there is an added dimension to this, which is, I think, the third problem, which is the problem of time in some senses. When we start thinking of memory, motivations which are linked to, and I don't want to get into, Husserl uses these words called primary retention, secondary retention, tertiary retention. But basically what it is that whenever new information comes to you, you first bring it into some kind of memory. You first encounter it immediately in that moment. It becomes some kind of memory, and if you want it, you can make it a technical memory later on through objects, through data, through information, and so on and so forth. That is tertiary retention. But what he's saying is something much more radical than that. What he's saying is that when we encounter an object, the memory is not only of the past, it is also of the future. So when you see a ball moving, you're also anticipating its next step. You're not only interpreting where its trajectory is coming from, you are always anticipating, which is why you cannot think of desire only in a synchronic system. You have to think it diachronically. And it is only in that authentic diachronic system that other comes to you. Otherwise, in a synchronic system, the other is always your own self. The other is always known to you. And that question of anticipation in that, and which is what I think you were referring to when you're referring to Todd McGowan, that when you interpret the past, something of the future immediately changes. Because the anticipation of the future changes, your trajectory of that, and that's a shift, that's a change which cannot be calculated in the advance. It's not a change that you can consciously think that if I interpret it, this change will happen. It's not that form of And I think I'll leave it there. And I think there's something we can, questions we can think about. Yeah.
Magnificent. And as we come up on the end, please, everyone, if you have final words, go right ahead. I'd love to hear you. Something I just want to say on that, Chetan, on the idea of the problems with any dichotomy, say between creation or creativity, you're also getting at the problem of thinking in terms of past, present, and future, right? Like, because they're always together. If we take Hegel seriously, a way I would just kind of put it, if we take Hegel seriously to the point where we start talking about like pan-dialecticism, like Mr. Bard will talk about, then there are no ands in reality, only slashes. There are no ands, only slashes. There is no creation and causation. There is only creation / causation. There is no past and present and future. There is only past / present / future. There is no bookcase and wall. There's only bookcase / wall. Like, there is a radical unity of which at the same time the slash does not mean a reduction of difference, but a perpetual tension of all things existing with all other things, trying to define themselves as independent, but only doing so in a relation of things that they require to be independent as such. If there was no present, you couldn't think of the past or the future. If there was no future, you wouldn't have a present. And so there's this thing in which this is the big problem. What Hegel is basically teaching us, and I think Mr. Bard is correct, that we need to basically be pan-dialecticist. I think that's exactly right. The brain necessarily understands the world in terms of and, whereas the world is a place of slashes. And so there is always a vast disconnect between the brain that is trying to understand the world, that is forced to operate linearly to comprehend of a thing that the moment you refer to it linearly, you're referring to something that is not there. And yet that's all you have to get at what's there. All you have to get at what's there is what is not there. And so I was telling this to Highroot once on, like, I like writing because in writing, I can like show the slash, I can like talk about causation / creation, but in speech, it's like very hard. You can't say like causation / speech, it's like causation and speech. And then the issue is, in given moments of time, there's more of a emphasis on causation and an emphasis on creation. So you're speaking it in singularity to emphasize, but that creates the impression in speech that it is a part, and that's a great problem in different things. And actually, it makes me think I want to kind of write a book or a paper on how Derrida talks about everything going to like written to escape. Well, it's actually, there's a Hegelian analysis on how language itself tends us in the direction of and away from slash, and that all of like so much of philosophy is operating in the place of the and, whereas the radicalness of Hegel is that he's thinking the slash. And by the slash, I mean like that horizontal slash, not a dash. That's like a dash. I mean like the slash. And so that's where Hegel is so radical. And that's where when we think about being, we have to think being / becoming / nothing. Like all of these things have to exist together. And the slash, but the moment we talk, and then I'll pass it on, thinking and structuring one's story and theme according to the slash as opposed to and seems to have a lot to do with escaping capture. It seems to have a lot to do with seeing things in a manner where you are not bound to your immediacy. And it seems to have a lot to do with, say, working toward the Nietzschean child. And for me, as you know, I'll refer to the movement from and to slash, like in the book, is as an absolute choice, because you are then seeing the world in terms of the slash as opposed to and. So I think what you're getting at is excellent, Chetan. And then, of course, for me, it's an interesting question of what are the practices, whether it be in psychoanalysis, therapy, everyday life, marriage, whatever, what are the practices to live according to a slash versus an and? What is someone that makes one habituate themselves into a life of slash as opposed to and? What does that look like? How does one do that? And then how does one find intrinsic motivation to maintain a life of the slash as opposed to the and? But with that, anyone else who would have anything else to say before we draw it to a close, please. And thank you, Chetan. Very excellent.
I just had a really quick comment. Thank you for everyone's contributions. Is also great. So great. I'm gonna have to think really hard on what you said, Chetan. Thank you for that. I wanted to just really quickly say that I wonder if we have lost the ability to be childlike, because a lot of what children do in their childlikeness is often called childish. Because people can't be bothered. Like, people don't like to be bothered. And so, I think we have a very like low tolerance for the curiosity and the mess and the exploration and the questions, the constant questions that children bring and you just exhibit in their beings. And so I think yeah, I'm very curious on that, because it's very, we start to get into like, well, you're saying, Daniel, the sort of who gets to decide what's childish versus childlike, But I think that unfortunately there is often like children are just being children, but it's being called childish, not childlikeness, and sort of the understanding that sometimes like we have to sort of maybe understand that we have a slash with children themselves. It's not that there's the children and there's the adults. It's like we have to see ourselves in what they do, just as they're seeing themselves in what we do. So I think that's, to me, interesting. And it's merely an initial thought, but I'd like to think harder about that. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Daniel, for hosting.
Adding a little bit to what Daniel said is that the slash instead of and, it's really radical in the implications, because just even in something as important as relationships, right? For example, if you have, I don't know, a friend that's like slash girlfriend, like the way that you relate, it's different. Like if it's become like you're both at the same time, like in a very practical way, you change. Or if it's like sometimes a friend, sometimes a girlfriend, sometimes, right? And just like to make it like very specific, right? You can make any two type of labels and interchange them. But like if it's slash, right? If it's both at the same time, you could see like the way you relate to the person changes. So I think that's like even the implications of the thing are really powerful. Because and normally we don't like the both labels at once. We like girlfriend or like friend, right? Like if you like, no, this is like they're different, it's no slash, it's different, right? The way you treat like a significant other, a girlfriend is different than a friend, right? And like of course it is and stuff, but like when you have the slash, like the way you understand the concept is like, of course, like friend is like a girlfriend is also a friend, like it's like it's more, and it's like I will also have to think through it, because it's the implications are interesting and difficult to fully visualize, but it even changes the way we relate to other people in a very practical and immediate sense, right? So I think that was really, really good. Yeah, thank you.
I'll just quickly say that, when you talk about childlike, you're talking about the way you anticipate the future. When you're talking about childishness, you're talking about the way you take the burden of your own past, the memory in that sense. And it's an interesting way to think about that kind of a distinction in some senses, that when you're a childlike, you're actually anticipating something without the burden of your past. That's how a child is. A child actually encapsulates both these things, the infantilization also, and this potentiality to become adult also in some senses, and the potentiality to be always becoming something. This past and future actually comes back to that kind of a thinking. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Chitan, Cadell, Emilio, Sanduni, Michelle, thank you for being here. Really enjoyed it. It makes me think, just as a thought, it does seem as if there's a difference between the child who doesn't have the burden of the past, an adult who doesn't escape the burden of the past, and the Nietzschean child who then reinterprets the past as not being a limiting factor, but something that they can create too. And that seems to be the kind of Hegelian move. And obviously I always talk about the Humean journey from the common life to the ivory tower philosophy, but then back to the common life, so that they don't fall into the banality of evil, but in fact actually are philosophically concrete and grounded, which then also, as one more advertisement, makes me think, I think what Mr. Samuel Barnes in his new book, The Iconoclast, Mr. Barnes is not paying me to say this, but he probably should. We'll talk about that difference between having philosophy be concrete and grounded in different things. Very elegant, by the way, very elegant work. But anyway, thank you so much. I think, as we've been talking, there's this notion of a movement from and to slash we talked about, this movement of something about philosophical developmentism that seems very important, something about kind of following the relation between story and philosophy that seems very important, something about being aware of how technology structure our towardness, and then also something about being aware of the story we tell ourselves, of which shapes the philosophy that we organize ourselves according to. All of these seem to be pieces in this puzzle of this question of avoiding capture, this question of not ending up at the end of a episode of Black Mirror that's sad, or being stuck in Kafka, if we were to speak to the theme. So I appreciate everyone's contributions to continue in that journey.